Understanding God's plan, lesson 9. We've been from the very beginning right on through to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to Israel going to the land of Egypt until last week was being delivered, a week before last, delivered from Egypt, from the Pharaoh, and getting ready to leave Egypt, and the plagues that were foisted upon the Egyptians because of Pharaoh not wanting to let the people go. And so we covered all that, and we got to the point where Moses is getting ready to lead them out of the promised land. So I want to take us from there tonight. And we'll go into the 12th chapter of the book of Exodus. If I'm jump back and forth a couple of times, so don't get confused thinking I'm confused, because I probably am, but that's beside the point. Exodus 12, verse 40. The time that the Israelites lived in Egypt was 430 years. At the end of 430 years, on that same day, all the Lord's divisions went out from the land of Egypt. It was a night of vigil in honor of the Lord, because he would bring them out of the land of Egypt. This same night is in honor of the Lord, a night vigil for all the Israelites throughout their generations. This same night is in honor of the Lord, a night vigil for the Israelites throughout their generations. Why is it important to honor the Lord in this particular situation, or any situation? Why did they need to honor the Lord in this? Why did they need to make celebrations and festivals and things and all that nature to honor the Lord? Why? Who delivered them? And so every time when you praise and honor God, you're honoring the person and acknowledging that he is our deliverer. He's the one who set us free. And if we don't make plans, for instance, I think it's a very good habit to plan to come to church on a regular basis. And the reason I do is because people say I can sit at home and I can worship God just as good at home on my couch as what I can in church. Well, there's some truth in that, but the truth also is when you do something on a regular basis and get in a habit of doing something, it's going to be more on your mind and more on your heart than if you don't. And so that's the reason we celebrate Christmas, we celebrate Easter, we celebrate different occasions, we celebrate our birthday, have things of that nature, and it helps us to remember. And if not, we forget. And they didn't need to forget because it was important. So we're going to go to the 12th chapter, the 17th verse. You are to observe the festival of unleavened bread, because of this very day I brought your divisions out of the land of Egypt. You must observe this day throughout your generations as a permanent statute. You are to eat unleavened bread in the first month, from the evening of the 14th day of the month until the evening of the 21st day. Now, what is the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread? What are those two festivals? What's the Passover? What does it commemorate? Pardon me? They killed the lamb. They killed the Passover lamb, and they put the blood on the doorpost and the lintel, and the angel of death would pass over their household. If I knew that's what it took to have the death angel to pass over my house, I'd paint some blood on top of my door too. Yes, Edna?
Tommy probably doesn't even know that he's there. When COVID first started, they had this thing about, putting a red ribbon over your door or something in honor of the Passover and hoping the Lord would pass over your house and I have tied a ribbon up there and it's still there. I'm still believing that they kept us safe.
So you put a ribbon up over your door because of COVID, and Tommy doesn't even know it's there. Huh?
No.
If at least it's not around your neck. But if I knew it would keep my household from dying, to paint some blood up there, I'd paint some blood over my doorpost as well, and the lintels and the doorpost. It's symbolic. It's a visual. It's something that helps you remember things, and that's the reason we do things. The things that we do in church, the way we do things, the way we have, like we have crosses. Why do we have crosses up? Because that reminds us of who Jesus is and what He did, and so on. So those things help us to remember. And I've mentioned this a lot of times, that here in the church here, if you start over here on, I think it's this wall, and follow it around, it starts with the birth of Jesus and goes all the way, and you have to go through the door into the back to catch the one on this side and one on that side, but it follows the life of Jesus all the way through to His ascension on when you come up to this side. And that's the way the windows were put in here. I don't know if you all knew that when you built the building, but anyway, that's the way they were aligned when they were put up there. That was something that started back. The Greek Orthodox Church is still big into that type of thing, but they have a lot of iconography and statues and all. And the reason they got started in it is because so many of the people couldn't read, and you couldn't read, but you could see a picture, and this picture would tell the story. So they'd have a picture to tell the story rather than words, because the people couldn't read it anyway. So anyway, the Passover was to commemorate. They're supposed to have. We're going to do a Passover celebration here. Passover celebration was to commemorate what happened on that particular day. Instead of just telling your children, instead of you just remembering, every year at this particular time, at this certain time of year on the 14th of Nisan, that you have the Passover and you celebrate the Passover, you're commemorating what happened back then, so it reminds you of what God did in delivering the people. And when you tell at Passover, and if I don't do this when we're doing our Passover, remind me, you don't say when God set them free, it's when God set us free. So you make it like it's current. We're talking about us, because He was our redemption as well as the children of Israel. In fact, we are the children of Israel. We're of the covenant, the seed of Abraham, through Jesus Christ. So that's what the Passover is. So what's the Feast of Unleavened Bread? Didn't have time for the bread to rise, so they didn't put any yeast in it, so it didn't rise. Is that separate from Passover? How many days was Passover?
Didn't you just read 7 through the 14th?
Passover is one day. They only did the Passover one day. The Feast of Unleavened Bread is 7 days. Some people say it's 8 days altogether, it's Passover, but some people say the first day Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread starts on that day. So actually it's the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Nowadays you won't hear even a Jewish family, Orthodox Jewish family, talking about celebrating the Feast of the Unleavened Bread. They say they celebrate Passover for a week. Well, when you're reading in the Bible, and we'll probably have that scripture in a minute, it's actually two separate things. You have Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and you have them both because they commemorate two different things, but it's at the same time. So it's the same event, but it's two aspects of the same event. So Exodus 12:26. When your children ask you, see how this starts. When your children ask you, what does this ritual mean to you? You are to reply, it is the Passover sacrifice to the Lord, for He passed over the houses of the Israelites in Egypt when He struck the Egyptians and spared our homes. So the people bowed down and worshiped. So He's saying, He's giving you the reason here, and the reason you have these celebrations, the reason you have these things is so that you will remember, and you can pass it on from generation to generation to generation. So many times I know with our kids and raising kids, and then with grandkids coming along, I think that my grandkids know certain things, and then I'll say something about it, and they give me this puzzled look. And it's because, well, if nobody's ever told them, they don't know. And we forget that, and we have a tendency to assume certain things when really we need to cover these things in detail for each generation, because if you don't, it will be something that passes out of existence and doesn't happen anymore. We might cover some of this before we finish with this series. There came a time in Israel's history when it had been so long since they practiced anything to do with the temple, they forgot anything. They forgot all about it. And they were in the temple. Now this is my version of it. They stumbled across some writings, and they got reading it and said, we hadn't been doing this stuff. And they went to the king and said, look what we have found. And he said, well, let's get everything clean and put back in order, and let's reinstitute this again. They had forgotten about it because nobody had passed it from generation to generation to generation. And people have a tendency to forget. How is it that people, it's so puzzling to me and to all of you, I'm quite sure as well. How is it we can have young people today saying that communism is a better system than our system? In a constitutional republic or democracy, that communism is better. How can they even say that? Just puzzles me to no end, because we lived through those times. We saw what happened after. Like me, I was born not long after the end of World War II. We saw what communism did to the world. Through the 60s, we saw through the Cold War right on into the 70s. We experienced all this. My grandkids haven't. I have one grandchild that was born. I have 7 grandchildren. I only have one that was born in the 20th century. And she was born in 1999. So she barely made it. All the rest of them born in the 21st century. So they didn't experience the things that I experienced. So if I don't pass that down to my children, who pass it down to their children, and it's also my responsibility to pass it down to my grandchildren, they won't know. And so I can see how these people will come along and they think, well, communism is a better system because it's fair, because everybody has the same thing. Have you ever known a system where everybody really had the same thing? No, that's always been a lie and always will be. But it says, when your children ask you, what does this mean? Then you can tell them. In other words, you're having this ceremony, you're killing the Passover lamb, you're celebrating Passover, and while you're doing it, your child asks you, what is this? And you tell them. In other words, what you're doing leads to questions. So go back to Exodus 12:17. You are to observe the festival of unleavened bread, because on this very day I brought your division out of the land of Egypt. You must observe this day throughout your generations as a permanent statute. He says you do this forever. It's a permanent statute. You are to eat unleavened bread in the first month from the evening of the 14th day. From the evening of the 14th day, 14th of Nisan is Passover, the evening of the 14th day of the month until the evening of the 21st day. So this whole period of time for this whole week, it's like with us, we have Christmas is one day. It feels like it's more than one day, because we get prepared for it, we do all the different things, then all of a sudden it feels like it's already over. And but this, they have, I like the Jewish way of doing things. They have whole week-long festivals. They have times where they can really celebrate and enjoy the festivities. And you do this particular, this helps them commemorate, helps them remember what happened. When you're sitting there eating this bread without leavening in it, you can say, this stuff doesn't taste very good, but it reminds me of why we're eating this and the reason that it occurred and what time it occurred in our history. The Passover commemorates the deliverance of the people by the blood sacrifice of the Passover lamb. The Feast of the Unleavened Bread is what it says there. You are to observe the festival of unleavened bread, because of this very day I brought your divisions out of the land of Egypt. In other words, there's 2 different things that's being commemorated here, and so many times we conflate the 2 of them, we put the 2 of them together, but they're told not to, so that they're remembered. And so what the Jews do today is they celebrate a week of Passover, and you don't hear them talk about unleavened bread. Now, some of them you do, but most of them you don't, and they talk about it as Passover. I've got this is what I said just a few minutes ago about the Passover. Is it 2 different times? Is it 7 days or is it 8 days? And people still debate that, whether it is or whether it is not. But when the Jews, Orthodox Jews, the Jews of today, celebrate the Passover, they have to start several days in advance and clean their cabinets completely out, make sure there's not one crumb of yeast of any kind, any leavening in their house leading up to the Passover. So they're preparing for it in a different way. Now, being money conscious the way many Jews are, they don't throw their yeast away a lot of times. A lot of communities, they have Gentile communities that are with them, and they sell their yeast to them, who sells it back to them once Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread is over, once that week is over, so they won't have to throw anything away, and which is a smart thing to do, using your head. But it has a purpose and it has a reason for what they're doing and what they're eating. Why unleavened bread? Exodus 13:4, it says, today in the month of Abib, which is, Abib is the Hebrew name, the Chaldean name is Nisan for that particular month. It's the same month. You are, in fact, a lot of places spelled A-V-I-V, but it's pronounced like Abib. You are leaving. It says, when the Lord brings you into the land of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Hivites, and Jebusites, which he swore to your fathers that he would give you, and it slipped down, it says, for 7 days you must eat unleavened bread, and on the 7th day there is to be a festival to the Lord. Now, here is something that makes it interesting to me at Easter. We always say that when Jesus was crucified was on this particular day, and what day of the week was he crucified according to what our tradition? He resurrected on what day? Sunday, early Sunday morning. We say he was crucified on Friday. Jesus said, as it is with the days of Jonah, as he was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the whale, the Son of Man shall be 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the earth. Now, count up from Friday to Sunday morning, and how many days is that? It's not 3 days and 3 nights. So, the reason we say it's Friday is because in the Scripture it talks about because the next day was Passover, they had to take his body down off the cross. So we say, well, the next day was Sabbath, so they had to take his body down off the cross because the next day was Sabbath. So we say, well, that was, it must have been on Friday because their Sabbath was on Saturday. Well, if you notice here, it says the first day, the Passover, is a holy day, and the 7th day is a holy day. So it could be that it was the last day of Passover, which was considered a Sabbath. It might be that Jesus was crucified on a Wednesday or a Thursday. Does it matter? No, but I just thought that was interesting.
Does the Bible mention Good Friday like we say?
No. Nope. Never does. Never says Friday. Never says what day of the week it was. It says because the next day was the Sabbath. Is all it said. Well, the first day and the last day really of the Passover, first day and the 7th day, the last day is considered a Sabbath. In other words, a day of rest. You're supposed to, it's just like it is on the 7th day each week. So it could have been that. We don't know. But anyway, it's fun to think about. Exodus 13:8. On that day, explain to your son, this is because of what the Lord did for me when I came out of Egypt. Let it serve as a sign for you on your hand and as a reminder on your forehead, so that the Lord's instruction may be in your mouth. For the Lord brought you out of Egypt with a strong hand. Keep this statute at this appointed time from year to year. So he's repeating the same thing over again. Why is he repeating this so many times? Because we forget. If you don't repeat something over and over again, people are going to forget. You'll say the same thing and then people, I won't go there. Feast, holiday celebrations should be used as reminders to each generation who our deliverer is. That's what we should use these for. What so many people use we say holidays. Where did we get the word holiday? From a holy day. Holiday. To us, a holiday is just a day off from work, a day to go to the beach, a day to go on vacation, a day to do whatever. In other words, it's not for what it really commemorates that we're doing. And we think about, like we have in America, we have Columbus Day, we have President's Day, we have 4th of July, Independence Day. We have all these days. We have Memorial Day, we have Veterans Day, and so many times we forget which one's which. It's two different commemorations for two different purposes because we don't talk about it enough to keep straight which is which. Exodus 12:34. So the people, now this is kind of explains it to you. So the people took their dough before it was leavened, with their kneading bowls wrapped up in their cloth on their shoulders. Now in verse 39, the people baked the dough they had brought out of Egypt into unleavened loaves, since it had no yeast. For when they had been driven out of Egypt, they could not delay and had not prepared any provisions for themselves. They didn't have time. The whole thing, you remember that he told them, God told Moses to tell the people, you kill the Passover lamb, but you be dressed, you have your traveling shoes on, you have your staff in your hand, you be ready because your deliverance is going to be quick. So they didn't have time to prepare anything. All they had to do was pack up. And can you imagine 2 million people packing everything up and getting everything ready and getting out of town in just in that one day? That would be interesting. God's deliverances is immediate and lasting. In other words, it's how hard is it for a person to, quote, get saved today? It's immediate. It's right now, and it's everlasting. It's like people say, you've heard me say this more than once. People say, what do you think of once saved, always saved? And I say, I go weeks and months at a time, don't think about it at all. I said, if I don't want out, it doesn't matter. It's totally irrelevant because it's eternal. Once God's gift for me was eternal. Now, what I do with it is up to me. Exodus 12:40. The time that the Israelites lived in Egypt was 430 years. The end of the 430 years, on that same day, all the Lord's divisions went out from the land of Egypt. It was a night vigil in the honor of the Lord because he would bring them out of the land of Egypt. This same night is in honor of the Lord, a night vigil for all the Israelites throughout their generations. Now, where were they going? They were going to what was called the Promised Land, the land of Canaan. Why was it important they went to that land? Why couldn't they stay in Egypt? Why couldn't God just take over Egypt and turn that over to them? Because the covenant with Abraham had to do with land. He told him, I'm giving this land to you as part of this covenant. I'm giving it to you and to all the generations after you forever. This land is given to you. So even today we have a land of Israel, and we have inhabitants there in the same place where it's always been. Have you ever thought about where Israel is located and the benefit to Abraham and to the Jews of being where it is? Over on one side, you have the Mediterranean Sea. So you had plenty of quantity of fish and sea life. You had a place where you could ship things in and ship things out. It was good in that respect. On the other side, over actually what was in the middle of it at that particular time, was the River Jordan and the Sea of Galilee up north, where you had fresh water. It was also, you had the Assyrians and the Babylonians and all the different empires over here. Then you had Egypt. Well, you had to pass right through this land of Canaan to get to any of them. So your major trade routes of the day came right through Israel. So that by nature, being in that particular place, they were in a prosperous area. They were in an area where they could influence a lot of different cultures, and they could be influenced by a lot of different cultures, and they could be, it didn't matter what it was they wanted. There was caravans coming through, and they could purchase them. So they lived in a land, instead of being out here on the end of an island somewhere where nobody ever saw you and never came through there, you could be easily supplied. So it's a good place to be. Exodus 13:1. The Lord spoke to Moses, consecrate every firstborn male to me, the firstborn from every womb among the Israelites, both man and domestic animal, it is mine. So he's saying the firstborn is mine. Period. Consecrate the first one to me. We'll get deeper into that, probably not today, but a week or so. When Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them along the road to the land of the Philistines. Now listen to what he's saying here. Even though it was nearby, for God said, the people will change their minds and return to Egypt if they face war. And the Philistines were a warlike people. So he led the people around toward the Red Sea along the road of the wilderness, and the Israelites left the land of Egypt in battle formation. And I probably won't get into it in this particular one, but when they camped in the wilderness, they didn't just, all of them just crowd in there and camp and set up your tents and set up your camp and all this kind of stuff. He had it where the tabernacle was in the middle with the Ark of the Covenant, and all that was in the middle, and all the camps would camp in order the way he told them around that. So when they came into camp, it would be like this. They would circle around and they would get into their position. When they left, they unwound this coil going back out when they went to the next place. Well, if you think a couple of million people, it tells us there were 600,000 fighting age men. So there had to have been a couple of million people. You're organizing a couple of million people. You don't just get up and yell and get somebody to run through there and say, hey, we're moving out today. Everybody takes off. What's going to happen? You got chaos. You're going to have a mess. So he even went down to the nth degree, infinite detail about how they were to camp, how they were to come into camp, how they were supposed to leave coming out of camp. And God's pretty smart, in case you didn't know. So I got this map. I don't know how well you can see it, but over here is where they were in the land of Goshen, and we say is Ramesses. And they left to go there. Well, they're going over here. This is where they're headed. So what's the best way for them to go? Shortest way for them to go is right through here. Right here is the land of the Philistines. And he didn't want to lead them through there, so he brought them down through here, up here, and they kind of messed up in here, which we'll talk about in a minute. And then they got all the way back, and they finally came up here and crossed the Jordan River over into the Promised Land. You see Jericho there. That's where they came into when they crossed the river. And you remember about Joshua at the Battle of Jericho. So we've heard that story many times and what happened. And you can see he took them kind of a roundabout way to get them up to here. What happened when they got up there the first time? You don't have to. I know you probably can't read this. Can anybody read this from where you are? This gives you key events of Israel in the wilderness. Up here's the 12 spies in Numbers, then the report of the 12 spies. Wanders in the wilderness for 40 years. Why did they wind up wandering in the wilderness for 40 years? Why was that significant? Because the first time they went, they refused to go in. And God said, until every last one of you dies off, we're not going to do this again. That's not the way he said it. But so they had to wait 40 years until all of them died off, and the next generation come. The only ones that were still living was out of that group was Joshua and Caleb, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Rebellion at Korah. The earth opens up and swallows Korah. This is when Korah challenged Moses and said, "Why are you our leader? Why are you and Aaron? Why are you so special? We're of the same tribe that you are. Why are you so special?" Well, it didn't pay off for him. Anyway, Aaron's rod budded because he took him out. What he did is God said, tell Aaron to bring his staff up here, and tell this crowd, each one of them to bring their staff up here. It's got, Tommy's setting off an alarm here.
Emergency SOS.
Phone's going off in emergency. You tell me what up.
Anyway, the next day when they came and checked, Aaron's rod had budded. Here it was, a dead piece of stick, and it had budded. So that's what it's talking about there. And then the death of Miriam, Moses smites the rock instead of speaking to the rock. Edom refuses a safe conduct. And you can read out down here, down at Mount Orus, when the death of Aaron at 123 years old. He lived a pretty good long time. In Numbers 20 and 33. Fiery serpents, the brass serpent on a pole. Balaam, the incident that happened with Balaam. Plague destroys 24,000. Moses views the promised land but can't go in. Why couldn't he go in? Because of what happened back over here when God told him to speak to the rock, and he smote the rock instead of speaking to the rock. Death of Moses is 120 years old. Joshua becomes Israel's leader. Then the two spies, Rahab helps the two spies, and so on. And you see, that gives you kind of a rundown of what occurred during this whole 40-year period that they were out here in the wilderness. Throughout the rest of Exodus and through Leviticus, God gives detailed instructions to his people through Moses. Well, he continues that, and in Deuteronomy repeats some of the things. In fact, the two places in the Old Testament where you can read the Ten Commandments is in the book of Exodus and the book of Deuteronomy. It's listed in both of them in order when you're reading the Ten Commandments. And he did all this, these detailed instructions. Why did he go to all this detail to create all these laws for his people to follow? Protection. Why didn't he just stick with just 10? He had 10. I mean, that'd be easy. That's easy enough. You can remember 10. But you go over here and some people say it's between 600 and 700. Some people say, well, they're real. Some of them are the same, so it could be 400. It doesn't matter. There was a bunch of laws, and if you sit down and read the last part of the book of Exodus, you read Leviticus, and you read into Numbers, and you get to reading everything there. Reading Leviticus gets to be fun, doesn't it? But all these laws and everything, but he was very specific because he knew that they needed some kind of instruction, because if they didn't have something to follow, some law to follow, and actually all the laws that were laid down afterwards, after the Ten Commandments, you could see where they were tied back into the Ten Commandments. And where the law that was given there had to do with the details that they went into later on. I said it was obvious that they needed detailed instructions, and you could tell that after a while anyway. So we're going to jump over to Deuteronomy for a minute. Deuteronomy 1:6, the Lord our God spoke to us in Horeb. You have stayed at this mountain long enough. You've been here long enough. Resume your journey to the land of the Canaanites and to Lebanon, as far as the Euphrates River. See, I have set the land before you. Enter and take possession of the land the Lord swore to give to your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and their future descendants. You see, in Deuteronomy, he's still talking about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's not just me repeating that over and over again. It's repeated over and over again in the Scripture because he wants us to get the idea and understand what he's talking about here. And you notice, see how the Lord is spelled here? What do you notice about it? It's all caps, even though these are smaller, because every time you can tell that's not when it's the Hebrew word for this, the Lord is spelled that way so that you'll know that's what it is. So it's for all this. It says, see, I have set the land before you. Enter and take possession of it. It's time for you to go take possession of it. Now, I want to give you a list of some of the complaints that the children of Israel griped to Moses about. Now, I don't know about you. And there's many times, in fact, when they got to the Red Sea and Pharaoh was behind them with his armies, what did the people say? Why did you bring us out here in the wilderness for us to die? We could have died just as well in Egypt. We had it pretty good in Egypt. Now, did they have it pretty good in Egypt? No. Their male children were all supposed to be killed when they were born. That sounded like a nice, friendly place to live to me. But they said, we had it good in Egypt, and you bring us out here. So all the time he was out there, they griped to Moses for 40 years. Wouldn't you like to have been that leader? So I decided I would list some of their complaints. The people complain about their hardships in 11:1. This is all in the book of Numbers. And the rabble among them had greedy desires and said, who will give us meat? Why were they saying this? They didn't have anything to eat, so God rained manna out of the sky for them every day. On the sixth day, he said, collect enough for 2 days, because on the Sabbath, you're not going to have it. You're not supposed to work on that day. And if they collected more than what they're supposed to, it would spoil. And so they were feeding them manna. Well, they got tired of being fed for free. We want some meat. They didn't have anything, not complaining. And Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses. And I won't get into detail, but that's his brother and sister, in case you don't remember. They spoke up against Moses. They gave him a hard time. Everybody else is giving him a hard time, so why don't they just pile in as well and help him out? And all the community raised their voices and grumbled against Moses and Aaron, it says in the 14th chapter. And Korah with Nathan and Abiram with 250 leaders of the community rose up against Moses. That's in the 16th chapter. And the entire community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. And the people quarreled with Moses, 20th chapter. And the people spoke against God and Moses, talking against all of them. I would have gotten tired of this way before now. I'd say, look, folks, you go where you want to. I was doing pretty good over where I was. I'm going to go back and get my sheep and herd some sheep, and you can do what you want to do. But for 40 years, he had to put up with this. I heard one Bible teacher, in fact, we were talking about this particular woman today. She's 91 now. She said she didn't understand it, why God wouldn't let Moses in the promised land just because he hit the rock instead of speaking to it. She said that by that time, I'd have been hitting the people with that stick. And I agree with her. I would have too. Numbers 11:11. So Moses asked the Lord, now listen to this. Moses asked the Lord, why have you brought such trouble on your servant? Why are you angry with me, and why do you burden me with all these people? Did I conceive all these people? Did I give them birth so that you should tell me, carry them at your breast as a nursing woman carries a baby to the land that you swore to give their fathers? Where can I get meat to give all these people? For they are crying to me, give me meat. He's talking to God. This is Moses talking to God. I can't carry all these people by myself. They are too much for me. If you're going to treat me like this, please kill me right now. If you are pleased with me, don't let me see my misery anymore. Is he having a bad day? And I don't blame him. I'd have been the same way. Like I said, I'd have been long gone before now. He's made out of better material than I am. So he's complaining to God, and he's saying, look, we think, a lot of times, we think God's feelings are real tender, and we can hurt his feelings so easy. You think you can say anything that God hadn't heard? Hundreds of times. Well, Moses, he's just pouring out his heart. He said, this is the way it is. I'm sorry. 13:1. The Lord spoke to Moses. Now we're moving ahead a little bit, so a familiar part here. The Lord spoke to Moses, send men to scout out the land of Canaan. I am giving to the Israelites. First, look what he says. The land I am giving to the Israelites. He said, I'm giving this land to the Israelites. Not they have to earn it, not they have to buy it. He said, I'm giving this. Okay. Send one man who is a leader among them from each of their ancestral tribes. Moses sent them from the wilderness of Paran at the Lord's command. All the men were leaders in Israel. These were their names, and I'm going to list these names in just a second, but I want to point out something about them when I get there. I'm not going to read them all, but see what I'm getting at here. Do you think God didn't know what these spies, these people that were spying out the land, you think God didn't know what they were going to come back and say? Why did he tell Moses to send them? Why did he tell him in the first place? Why didn't he just say, look, here's what you need to do. You just need to get over and you're going to cross the river. You're going to go over and you're going to take over the land. He didn't. He said, send these people in. Send these men in. Let them scout out the land. Let them see what we need. And out of all these, I underline two names. Caleb and Hoshea, it says here, that's Joshua. Notice what tribes they're from. You can't see that one because there's a price tag hanging over it. It says, Caleb, son of Jephunneh, from the tribe of Judah. And it says, Joshua, son of Nun, from the tribe of Ephraim. Now, why is that? Why do I think that's interesting? When Jacob was, just before he died, he prophesied and spoke over each one of his sons. Which one did he give the best blessing to? To Judah. Which one was the tribe that Jesus came from? Judah. Now, who is Ephraim? Joseph had two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. The oldest was Manasseh, the youngest was Ephraim. When Jacob said, bring your sons in here and I'm going to bless them. And he brought them in there and he put Manasseh, for Jacob to put his right hand on Manasseh's head because he was the oldest, his left hand on Ephraim's head because he was the youngest. And what Jacob did was he crossed his hands like this. And Joseph said, no, he grabbed his hand and said, no, you're doing it wrong. He said, trust me, I know what I'm doing. He gave the better blessing to Ephraim. Now, how is it that Jacob, 430 years earlier, could have known that about these two tribes? I would say he was pretty close to God, wouldn't you? And he spoke even to the point where the two that came back with the good report were Joshua and Caleb, and they were from the tribe of Judah and from the tribe of Ephraim, the ones that Jacob told, the ones that Israel said would be the greatest out of those tribes. I just thought that was interesting. If you don't, just forget that part. Verse 31. This is their report. We can't go up against the people because they are stronger than we are. Does that shock you that these people come back to this report? So they gave a negative report to the Israelites about the land they had scouted. The land we passed through to explore is one that devours its inhabitants, and all the people we saw in it are men of great size. We even saw the Nephilim there. The descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim. To ourselves we seemed like grasshoppers, and we must have seemed the same to them. There's that last sentence there is something that's so important to all of us. How you see yourself is the way other people will see you. If you see yourself as worthless, that's the way other people will see you. If you see yourself as important, that's the way other people will see you. That's just the truth in life. And they were saying they'll see us that way. Now there's people that say in here, the Nephilim here, they say that's back in the 5th, 6th chapters of Genesis, they're talking about the giants, the big people in the land, they're talking about the Nephilim, and they're saying that's who these are the descendants of. What's the problem with that? What followed right after that is called Noah and the flood. They didn't have any descendants because they were all drowned. So, but still, people, I think this is pretty obvious. But they came back with this report. Because of this report, they wound up wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. Because they decided we're not going in because they can beat us. So why would God send them in the 14th chapter? Then Moses and Aaron fell down with their faces to the ground in front of the whole assembly of the Israelite community. Joshua son of Nun and Caleb son of Jephunneh, who was among those who scattered out the land, tore their clothes and said to the entire Israelite community, the land we passed through and explored is extremely good land. If the Lord is pleased with us, if the Lord is pleased with us. You notice that. It says the Lord is pleased with us. He will bring us into this land, a land flowing with milk and honey, and give it to us. Only don't rebel against the Lord, and don't be afraid of the people of the land, for we will devour them. See what they're saying? They're talking about all these great giant men and everything. Said, if God's on our side, we will devour them. We will succeed. Their protection has been removed from them, and the Lord is with us. Don't be afraid of them. And I put majority rule is not always best. Our government that we have in the United States, is it majority rule? Majority rule is democracy. So are we a democracy? No. We're a constitutional republic. We're a democratic republic. If you had to go by majority rule all the time, that means 50% plus one makes all the decisions. You talk about something that's bad for the minority, that would be. But we're not under that system. But God had told Moses and Aaron, and evidently to Joshua and Caleb, what his will was. And I would say God's will is more important than what you think of the situation. If God tells you you can handle it, you can handle it. Then we go to the book of Joshua, Joshua 5:13. And it says, when Joshua was near Jericho, he looked up and saw a man standing in front of him with a drawn sword in his hand. Joshua approached him and asked, are you for us or for our enemies? Neither, he replied. I have come as a commander of the Lord's army. Then Joshua bowed with his face to the ground in worship and asked him, what does my Lord want to say to his servant? Any questions?